In this tech tip, I would like to introduce you to the concept of front seating and back seating service valves. But before we get into that, it's important to know that you will need in your toolkit a service valve wrench. To give you an idea how much they cost, this is a quick search on Amazon Prime. Lower quality, you're looking at around $16, $17. High quality, much closer to $40, $45 for both the bit and the service valve wrench. And you need to make sure that it includes 3/8, 1/4 inch, 5/16 in order to be ready for the most common service king valves you're going to run into the field. When dealing with condenser split systems, you'll find your king valve for your suction line and your king valve or your service valve for the liquid line at the outdoor condenser unit. Now, you'll have to remove the caps. It's very important to keep these tight. And if you suspect a leak, you may have to add some leak stop. There's leak stop called Big Blue that's really good, or there's some other brands, but some kind of Teflon based material that will stop it. Also, if you notice, you do not want to leave these caps on, just a side note, when you solder or braze, because you'll melt those rubber gaskets, and that's the only thing preventing you. There's a rubber gasket in here, there's a rubber gasket on the cap. That's the only thing preventing you from losing your refrigerant. That and this 3-cent valve core that really we need to do a better job of finding a way to prevent refrigerant loss, but that's all we have right now. You'll also need your service tool that has 2 different sized Allen wrenches that fit in. And if you look at the small and the large king valve, it makes sense, right? Because you got a liquid line that's much smaller than a suction line. The liquid line king valve takes the smaller size. And what I wanted to show you here, so if you turn it all the way to your left until you feel resistance, and don't force it, if you're using 50% of your strength, you're going too far, then you have back seated or opened that all the way up, which means that this liquid line, this small line, is open to the condenser. If I were to go the other way and turn it all the way to the right until I feel resistance, quite the opposite. I have front seated all the way down and close this valve off to the condenser. Now, the part that confuses people, if I hook up nitrogen or refrigerant and add it to this port, it will never get into the condenser itself. It will only go through the liquid line and back feed to the evaporator coil. These valves will not isolate the evaporator. They will only isolate the condenser or the outdoor unit. Same thing for the suction line king valve. If I turn it all the way to the right until it stops, I have isolated the suction line to the condenser. So if I hook up to this port and add refrigerant, this suction line will backfeed all the way to the evaporator on the indoor unit. However, I will never be able to put refrigerant into the condenser. There's a lot of useful reasons why that is. One, you can ship outdoor condensers with factory charge to specs for 15 or 20 foot of line set. 2, you can pump refrigerant if your compressor is working. Say you have a leaky evaporator coil, you can use the compressor to pump refrigerant into the compressor by first shutting down your liquid line all the way, leaving your suction valve open, and then pushing in the contactor and sucking the refrigerant back to the compressor. Once you get it down to 0 psi, you quickly shut off your suction, Now all your refrigerant is forced into the outdoor unit. You can braze or replace the indoor coil, replace the indoor TXV valve, whatever you need to do without using your refrigerant. Now you can only do that if your compressor is still good. You cannot pump everything back into the evaporator. You can shut it off and save a little bit of refrigerant, but you can't pump all your refrigerant back into the evaporator. Other notes about split systems is simply you need to be super careful not to overheat these. They should always be wet ragged while you're brazing. They are prone to leaks. You'll have a solder joint in the back and a solder joint in the front to replace it. They are brass copper coating. So when you're brazing these, if you add heat too long, you're going to melt that copper off the brass, and then you'll need a special brazing rod. I often heard it colloquially called orange rod. It has an orange tint to it, just to be able to finish that braze. So a mistake people make, it's not the amount of heat so much, it's the duration that you apply heat to this valve that people burn them up. You burn that valve up and it can't close, or it can't open all the way, and it needs to be replaced. So very different than a refrigeration system, but this is your suction line king valve, also known as your suction line service valve, liquid line key valve, service wrench with 2 different size fitting. I love this little tool. In a pinch, you can get the good old fashioned Allen wrenches and do it mechanically, but if you notice, there's quite a bit of room and play. It takes some time, especially on the suction valve, even with a ratcheting service wrench, to close that all the way. Still going, still going. You can hear the ratcheting motion working. I'm getting several clicks each turn, and there, I'm finally closed. So it's nice. These are definitely a must-have in every service technician or installer's toolkit. On a refrigeration unit, it's a little different than a HVAC split system or package unit. You typically have your liquid line service valve, your suction line service valve, and then you have your liquid receiver service valve. You use this to pump the liquid refrigerant back into the receiver anytime you want to isolate the evaporator section to do work, kind of like using the compressor to pump it down. You're still going to use the compressor to pump it down, but you're going to store it in the liquid receiver. Now, on these valves, slightly different. Let's start with the suction. You need to remove your cap, and unlike the split system, they have the exact size for your service valve wrench to fit over. You've got a 3/16, a 1/4 inch, a 3/8, and a 5/16 for different size service valves. In this case, I am on the wrong side, working with a 1/4 inch if I line it up correctly. Now, to front seat, you turn it all the way to the right, and we're front seated. That means we're closed off to the compressor, okay? That does not mean that I'm closed off to this line. So if I were to hook up to this valve port and pump refrigerant in, if I am all the way front seated, I am not adding refrigerant to my compressor, but I'm going to backfeed refrigerant all the way through my line back into the evaporator coil. If you want to open it to the compressor, it's what's called back seating. You'll go all the way until you feel resistance. Do not force it. But once we're all the way back seated, we are open to the compressor. This has a lot of applications, very much like a split system. You can isolate the compressor by itself. To replace the compressor, you can pump all the refrigerant through the condenser coil and store it in the liquid receiver, and then close off your liquid line side. And now you have access to the compressor, the suction line, and the evaporator. and the liquid line until it goes or comes out of the liquid receiver. So keep that in mind. Very similar to a split system with slight differences, but that is how you back seat and front seat a service king valve, suction side, liquid side on a refrigeration system. Now you can notice you can use a wrench to do this. It'll take forever. You must invest in a service valve wrench.